So a quick disclaimer that this training is, and in the Southeast PTTC, we're 100% supported by SAMHSA of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And what you're going to hear today are the views of our author, Stephanie Strutner, and they do not necessarily represent nor are they official views of SAMHSA, the HHS, or the U.S. government. So we welcome and celebrate our diverse community of professionals, and we really strive to create an inclusive atmosphere that respects the broad spectrum of identities and backgrounds of all of our participants. And inclusivity begins with our language and the words that we choose to use. And our goal is really to bring everyone into the conversation. So as I said, I'm with the Southeast Prevention Technology Transfer Center. We are one of 10 regional centers around the United States, funded by SAMHSA to provide free technical assistance and training to the prevention workforce. We are in the dark blue. We serve 8 states, from Kentucky all the way down to Florida and over to Mississippi. And we're under the direction of Drs. Kimberly Wagner and Mark Wolfson. And we're located in Winston-Salem, North Carolina at Wake Forest University School of Medicine. So if you're from another state, which many of you are, you can look on this map and see that you do have a PTTC that is there to serve your needs. So don't hesitate to reach out to them. There's also an addiction technology transfer center, and there is a mental health technology transfer center. And you also have access to the ORN, the Opioid Response Network. So after this webinar, or when you close it out, or if you have to leave early, you're going to be sent to an external site. That's just the evaluation that we would really appreciate you taking the time to fill out. One of the big outcomes for SAMHSA are our evaluations from our participants, how many people we serve, and what sort of feedback we get. We also review those evaluations and we apply what you're asking of us to future trainings. So do take a chance to fill out that evaluation. Once you do, when you close out or when you're finished, the certificate of attendance downloads automatically, either up at the top in downloads or down at the bottom of your screen. And you can open up that PDF and customize it with your name and save it to your screen. So I know how important the certificates are. The last thing I want to add about this, as I said earlier, yes, this is being recorded and you'll be able to find it in a few days on our YouTube channel. You can download it and share it. We are your tax dollars at work, so these webinars are for you. Use them as you need. This is just our website, which I imagine most of you know about, the pttcnetwork.org/southeast. If you are not receiving our monthly newsletter, do sign up. You can join our email by clicking subscribe down at the bottom of our website, and you'll know firsthand all of the upcoming webinars. Speaking of upcoming webinars, tomorrow we are doing our first webinar on psychostimulants, and I'm really excited about our speaker. So if you haven't signed up for Promoting Prevention by Understanding the Who, What, and Why of Psychostimulant Use, please do check that out. And then early in February, we're doing a Lunch and Learn. This is a collaboration between us, our partners to the north, the Central East PTTC, and SPTAC, who is another SAMHSA-funded organization that focuses on SAMHSA-funded grantees, and they really focus in on the SPIF. So it's another free resource for you. And then near the end of February, we have Practical Skills in Prevention, Making the Magic Happen in a Meeting. And those two ladies that are going to be presenting that, they're wild and fun, so you don't want to miss out on that webinar. It should be really engaging as well. But today we're going to focus on today's webinar, which is part 2. Unfortunately, Carlton, he is not able to be here, so we've got Stephanie Strutner again leading the charge. I'm going to try to shorten this introduction so that we can get on with it. But Stephanie is a retired Substance Use Prevention Coalition Director. She owns and operates an independent consulting firm, Catalyst Evaluation Group, where she provides support to clients through measuring impact, conducting biostatistical and epidemiological analyses. She also serves as a consultant and trainer for CADCA. And so many more things. So I'm really excited I'm going to stop my share so Stephanie can bring up her slides and get going.
Thank you, Kristen, and good morning, everybody. I'm happy to see all of you today, and I just asked the same that I asked last time. I know that many of us are in places where we would prefer not share our camera screen, but if you can, I would just ask that you share your camera screen. We will have 2 breakouts in our training session today where we're going to ask you to interact, excuse me, with your peers in 2 very brief activities. These are for your professional development. And so in that breakout especially, we're going to ask you to turn on your camera and be active participants. And so we're following up today, as Kristen mentioned, on our workforce development series. We had session 1 on communications when we were together last week. It was just last week. It feels like so long ago to me. But just last week when we talked about your avatar, we talked about how we meet our population of focus and how we can be effective in planning to make sure that we're thoughtful, that we're branding our coalition effectively, and that we're marketing ourselves in a way that helps to maximize the reach of our strategies. We're going to build upon that discussion, but if you weren't here, don't worry. None of this will all make sense even if you didn't get the content last time. So today we're going to dive into the importance of interpersonal communication and talk about applying principles of active listening. It's so important that we as prevention providers in our communities are culturally competent, and that we don't just show up acting like we're the expert and talking at people all the time. Rather, we show up in an environment that we are prepared to listen and to hear what people have to say, especially those persons in our communities who have lived experience, and so that we can listen in order to seek to understand and not necessarily to seek to reply or be the expert voice in our community. We're going to talk about honing our skills in public speaking. When I travel across the country, this is something that people often ask is, how did you get to where you are comfortable with public speaking? And so we'll talk about that, because I'll tell you, the very first time I found myself in a public speaking situation as a professional, it didn't go very well, and I was terrible. So let that be a lesson to anybody who's out there feeling the jitters about public speaking. You too can hone your skills and become a good and powerful public speaker. We're going to also discuss interpersonal and group communication techniques so that we are skilled in one-on-one communication, but also skilled in group facilitation techniques as well. And then finally, we're going to wrap things up today talking about how our coalitions can plan for effective communication across their strategic plan. So thinking about the strategic prevention framework, how do we communicate effectively across each of those domains of our work? We're going to start off talking about the importance of interpersonal communication and how we apply principles of active listening. As community organizers, as leaders in our communities, it's really important that we are keenly aware and keenly capable of being active listeners. So when we're active listeners in our community, if we're facilitating problem analysis, for example, it gives us the ability to pause, because we're multitasking. If we're a facilitator and we're running through a problem analysis, we have to not only be able to write down on a whiteboard or chart paper what people are saying, but sometimes we have to be able to listen and interpret what they're saying and translate it onto paper simultaneously. And that piece of active listening is really important when it comes to being that facilitator. And so one thing that is foundational for us to understand is there are communication channels that occur in our communities. And every time we have an opportunity to communicate with a person, there is a channel that goes along with that. And so it's not just this one-on-one communication or communication with a group. Rather, there's a message that I, right now, am the sender. I am encoding a message that I'm sending across a channel. The channel for us right now happens to be WebEx, but I'm coding a message across WebEx. That message comes to you, but you as the receiver have to decode the message that I'm sending. You then decode that message, and in many instances, there is a feedback channel. And in that feedback channel, you all will provide both sometimes verbal, sometimes nonverbal methods of communication that help me as the sender revise my message that I'm sending you. So for example, I don't see this happening now. Anytime I am speaking on a virtual platform, I always have my slides for reference on the screen, but I always have a big view of the classroom. So I'm looking at each of you that have your camera on, and I'm sensing your nonverbal simultaneously while I'm talking, just as I would do in an in-person session. This is important because it gives me the opportunity to, if many people are sitting there wide-eyed looking at me, giving me the message that you don't understand what I'm saying, I'm going to stop and I'm going to go back and I'm going to try to encode that message in a different way. So Astrid is giving me nonverbals, telling me that Astrid understands what I'm throwing out into the classroom. So I am feeling pretty confident that we're all tracking along together right now. But in the event that that weren't the case, as the facilitator, as the communicator, I'm going to try again. And so that's an important piece of this communication channel, is making sure that we are encoding our messages in a way that our receiver can understand it and unpack it. So this goes back to our conversation last week when we were talking about your avatar. I might speak in different language if I'm speaking to a group of high-level prevention scientists than if I'm speaking to a group of fifth graders. It's just natural that my communication is going to be packaged a little bit differently. And that's what's so important for us to recognize as we communicate with one another, is we've got to be able to prepare communication that is understandable and that is able to be received by the person that we intend that communication for. And so just like we talked at length last week about making sure that our communication is packaged effectively, we have to make sure that also we understand this communication channel. We also, if you see there in the middle of the screen, you see those lines, that's noise. So we also have to understand that there can be noise that interrupts the receiving and the decoding of the message that we are sending. Sometimes that's no fault of ours, but it happens. And so we have to make accommodations for that noise. And as planners, we can plan in advance to try to minimize the noise that people are going to experience. But sometimes there's just, quite frankly, going to be noise, and especially depending on the avenues that we're trying to reach people. So noise could be any different manner. But right now, think about, and actually, I'm going to go ahead and pop forward because I'll ask you that in just a moment. So when we think about the transmission of our communication, we've got this message channel, and noise can sometimes get in the way. And noise isn't always, I think sometimes when we say noise, people think, oh, something audible that you hear. It doesn't always have to be something audible that you hear. So I'd like for you to turn to the chat box right now and think of some potential noise that might be related to our communication interaction today. What noise, you don't have to be experiencing, but what noise could you potentially experience in a WebEx virtual classroom? And lots of great answers here. Influx of emails, that is happening on my end. Phone calls, people walking into your office, someone who is unmuted, other people who are talking or speaking or watching other people on cameras, technical issues, not being heard, the sound of participants entering the meeting, poor connections, people in the background, pets in the videos, all the things going on around me because of the thin walls, the dog barking at the Amazon truck. All of these examples are really great examples of noise that we can experience. I would also go along to say that there could be noise that isn't even audible. For example, I might have an emotional burden that I'm carrying right now, which could present noise into my ability to receive a communication message or to even send one. And so it doesn't just have to be, and Dee Shepherd gave a great example, hunger. That's one of those great examples where we know if people are hungry, or if we were in person at a conference, inevitably not everybody can be comfortable. Some people are going to be freezing cold, some people are going to be hot, and only a very few people are going to be in the middle. For those people who are freezing cold, they're not going to interact on a level that is maximizing our communication. Too much coffee, Genia says. Yes, Astrid says some people may not have gotten a good night's slumber. And all of these examples are really strong examples of noise that we might encounter. So if you were a facilitator or you were trying to express communication with an audience and they were experiencing some of the noise examples that you've put forth in the chat box, what could you do as the sender of the communication to try to minimize that noise and make sure that your message got across to the receiver? Offering breaks, check-ins, asking questions. Oh, great idea of asking people to take a brief moment of quiet, practicing a little bit of mindfulness. Love that. Closing the door to the room, bringing a snack, asking for confirmation of understanding, giving people the option to stand up in the back of the room. Sometimes that's really empowering and it's just what people need. And great examples. So many examples here. I'm not going to talk through all of them, but please do refer to the chat box because your colleagues are coming up with some excellent options of how we can reduce that noise. So when we are the communicator, we want to acknowledge that there's a communication channel and that there can be noise that interrupts that channel. It is our responsibility to be an effective communicator to minimize that noise, to make sure that what we are intending to get across to our recipient is received and it's received effectively. So another piece of effective communication is when we're on the side of being the listener. And when we are the listener, there are two aspects of effective listening that become important. And I'll say that in my past experience, I am a person living with obsessive compulsive disorder and anxiety disorder. And so oftentimes when I'm talking to people, I will be worrying about something else that has nothing to do with our conversation. That prevents me from being an active listener. And so I have to be able to manage myself and my emotions and my feelings and what I have going on in my brain, my overactive brain, so that I can be a good listener too. Because being an active and a good listener is part of that communication channel. If I'm not an active and effective listener, that communication channel breaks down. And I'm not paying good enough attention to make sure that A, my message is received and understood, or B, the person with whom I'm communicating or the persons with whom I'm communicating's message is received by me and understood by me. And so when we engage in effective listening, we want to be an active listener. We're going to talk about that. We also want to create an environment for our target audience that is conducive to listening. So if there is a noisy fan clanging in the back of the room, we want to eliminate that noise. You've probably been in an in-person session before where there's a lot of noise in the hallway, and the person who is training or facilitating will just nonchalantly walk over and close the door while they continue to speak. We just want to come up with ways to minimize that noise so that we can allow people to truly engage in active listening. Sometimes people will set ground rules because one of the biggest barriers we have to being an active listener are our technology devices, our cell phones, our iPads, our watches, whatever it is, the electronics that we have in the room are constant interruptions to our communication channels. So one question that I'll ask you to turn to the chat box, or also feel free to unmute if you have a comment that you'd like to share here, is, are listening and hearing the same thing? What do you think?
Lots of no's.
I see that. The no's are coming in pretty strongly.
A few not usually. Listening is what the ears do. Hearing is what I do with my heart, says Astrid.
Love that.
And Angela says one involves processing the information.
That's a brilliant segue into this photo, because I loved Peanuts when I was a kid, and I always got so tickled at how the students perceived the teacher. Did you guys ever watch Peanuts or Charlie Brown? And how did the students hear what the teacher was saying? Do you remember? Wah, 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 wah. That's always how the teacher sounded. And so certainly they could hear the teacher's noise, but if they were just hearing wah, 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 were they really listening or understanding? I would argue to say no. And so let's unpack the difference between listening versus hearing. Excuse me. When we talk about hearing, we're talking about the physiological process of actually registering sound waves as they hit the eardrum. So we don't necessarily have control over what we hear. We could argue that we could wear noise canceling headphones or we could wear earplugs. But when we're talking about hearing, we're just talking about that physiological process where sound waves hit our eardrum. We have no control, generally speaking, over what we hear. The sound waves we hear have no meaning, and you all identified this in the chat box. Those sound waves have no meaning until we give them content and context. When we talk about listening, now we're transitioning from an inactive process to an active process. When we listen, we are constructing meaning from both verbal messages and nonverbal messages. The nonverbal messages can be just as important to convey intent as the verbal messages. Christine in the chat box says listening is intentional, and that's exactly right. Effective listening is very intentional. And sometimes our nonverbal messages, take for example, sarcasm. How many of you are keenly aware when someone is using sarcasm? Show of hands. Many of you. How many of you have a difficult time interpreting when someone is using sarcasm? Many people do. Sometimes we have to look for those nonverbals to be able to recognize when people are, for example, using sarcasm. I remember just a few weeks ago, I have a daughter who just turned 7, and a few weeks ago she said, "Mommy, what's sarcasm?" And so I had to define sarcasm for her, and it was kind of funny because she was trying to understand and then repeat back something using sarcasm. And so if we are talking with people, if we use, and Dara says that she speaks sarcasm fluently, and yeah, I get you, girl, same, but it's important to recognize that not all cultures incorporate sarcasm into their culture. And so we have to be emotionally intelligent enough to pick up on that fact. And so Kristen is reiterating that point in the chat box, that sarcasm used to be your love language, but you've tried to moderate it. Kristen, can you expand upon that a little bit? Tell us why.
While it made me laugh and maybe some people found it humorous, sometimes it put people off, and certain people did not find it funny, and I wasn't able to connect with everyone. So I've really had to work on part of it, I guess, is maturing too, moderate how I use it, when I use it, and with whom. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for your vulnerability and sharing that. And Bert also makes a comment that it's fine until it's passive aggressive. And Jennifer makes a really excellent point that in writing, it's hard to detect. And so when we think about noise and communication, one thing that we really didn't talk about was email communication or written communication. And definitely not even just sarcasm, but messages can be interpreted very differently when we don't have the verbal context. Tone, for example. A tone of an email can come across very differently than if I spoke the content of an email to you verbally. And so when we think about our communication channels, we have to take all of these factors into context. Oh, Susan raises a really interesting point in the chat saying, when I learned sarcasm came from the Greek word that means tearing of the flesh, it made me rethink how much I used it. Interesting. So let's think about active listening a little bit more. When we think about active listening, we're really requiring the listener to understand and interpret and then evaluate what they hear. We're understanding the information that's being communicated when we are actively listening. And here's an important point. We're understanding how the speaker feels about what they're communicating. This is one of the barriers between an email communication and a verbal communication. Because when we hear the tone in someone's voice, or if we're in person and we see their facial characteristics when they're communicating with us, we can interpret that emotion that comes along with what they're saying, which we can't always do through the written word. And so when we're actively listening, we're also ensuring that the speaker feels heard and they feel understood. This is a critical piece of active listening, and also a critical piece of your conversation continuing along. When we actively listen, we will summarize what someone has said. And this was something that you all came up with in the chat box. So if somebody is saying something to us and they've given a long-winded response, we might summarize what they said to make sure that we understand and to show them that we were listening. We will show interest as well. There are lots of different ways to show interest. One is looking at the person who's speaking to you. And we can show interest by sometimes our nonverbals, by nodding our head, or sometimes by taking notes. There are lots of different ways that we can show interest in what someone is talking about. When we're actively listening, we're also listening for feelings. That helps to give us context of what somebody is saying. We signal encouragement to people who are speaking often. And we signal encouragement by making eye contact, by, again, nodding our head, by just showing that we're listening. Sometimes when people are speaking, especially if you're in a larger group, you might give them a thumbs up. Or if a speaker says something that's very compelling to you or just really resonates with you, you might give applause. So we signal encouragement by lots of different means as well. We also are observing their nonverbal behavior. When we're actively listening, we observe nonverbal behavior in a lot of different ways. How many of you have ever been to a seminar where the presenter was very nervous and they were showing, I see some of your nonverbals, and I am interpreting by your nonverbals that this was an uncomfortable situation for you. So your speaker is very nervous. They're just wringing their hands, they're fidgeting, they can't stand still, they're speaking super fast, they're not breathing, they're having a hard time. You can tell their heart rate is increasing, and you find yourself sitting there holding your breath because you too are nervous with them. This is so common, and generally our audience wants us to be successful. And so that's why when you're an audience member and you sit there and your speaker is nervous, you feel those nerves too. Because when your speaker is holding their breath, you find yourself holding your breath too. And so that's one of our observations of nonverbal behavior. Now, when we're actively listening as well, we can pull a lot of emotion and intent from people's nonverbal behavior. Sometimes, if someone tells a joke, we might know it's a joke because of their facial features. Or if somebody is talking about some statistics, for example, that might be very heartbreaking, we could interpret that through some of their nonverbal behaviors. Again, when we are actively listening, we want to avoid interruption and distraction. And so we are not constantly looking at our phones. We're not constantly looking at the emails coming in on our watch. We are not constantly looking at the clock on the wall to see if the session is almost over. We're avoiding those interruptions. We're avoiding those distractions. Actively listening also involves asking probing questions. So if there's a comment that's made that you either want to clarify or you want to expand upon, that's a great opportunity to ask a probing question. It shows that you're listening. It shows that you're being active in that communication participation. We can reflect on what the individual is saying when we're actively listening. By reflecting, it might pull in some of our personal experience into validating what they're saying. Reflecting on what they're saying, and we could say, oh, you know, when I heard you say this, it made me feel whatever that feeling was that you felt. We can actively listen by avoiding prejudice. It is difficult for us because we all have implicit bias that we carry. We're not talking about implicit bias today necessarily, but by acknowledging our own implicit bias, it gives us the opportunity to acknowledge the bias that we have, because everyone has implicit bias. And it gives us the opportunity to avoid prejudice so that when we are actively listening, we're not prejudicial against what the person is telling us. We can ask open-ended questions, because if we start to feel ourselves be prejudiced, we can ask questions to make sure that we understand that intent, or to help us just to broaden our understanding of somebody else's lived experience. And then certainly we want to clarify if there's something that's happening in a communication that we don't understand or we're not really sure about, or maybe we thought, did I actually hear that correctly? We can ask those clarifying questions. Emily asks a question, do you have feedback for the fidgety ones? I feel there's some room for movement. Emily, we're going to talk about that today, so I'd like to ask your permission to push pause on your question, and we're going to come back to that when we talk about public speaking. So we'll get to that. And if we don't, you guys keep me accountable and make sure that we fully cover the effectiveness of public speaking. We'll get there. Thanks for your question. I'd like for you all to indulge in a brief activity here. And this is going to be, if you don't turn on your cameras for any other part of the day, I would appreciate if you would just turn on your camera for the next probably 15 minutes. You're going to be in small groups. And so you won't have to share with this larger group. You're going to be in small groups of about 5 people. And in your small groups, and we do understand that if you're driving, then we want you to make sure to be safe. We have created the number of 5 to make sure that we have at least a few people in the breakouts who are going to have their cameras on. Your breakout will be most effective the more people who can have their cameras on. So when you go to your breakout room, we're going to give you 6 minutes. You can exchange some pleasantries, but once you do that, and do just a brief introduction of name, we'd like for you to select a speaker. So this person who is designated as the speaker can speak for 60 seconds on any topic. Whatever topic you choose, you're going to be speaking to your small audience of about 4 more people on whatever you want to talk about. The listeners, so the people in your group who are not speaking, are going to be doing everything other than actively listening to you. So you guys who are going to be the listeners, you're going to show distraction. We're not going to maintain eye contact. You're going to show little to no nonverbal communication with the person who's speaking. And then after that 60 seconds, we want you all to have just a very quick debrief of how that felt in your breakout. And then we'll ask one or two groups to contribute to the larger audience about how your not actively listening session went. So any questions about what we're asking you to do here?
I will say it's quite interesting to see how many people flee the room when we talk about breakout sessions. We dropped like 20 people immediately jumped out.
Oh man.
It's okay if you don't have a camera. It's okay if you're driving in your car, and it's okay if you hate breakouts. We're not forcing you to do anything, and it's really short. It's only 5 minutes. But when you get in there, you got to select a speaker, and that speaker is going to speak on something, maybe something they're passionate about for 60 seconds. And you said the listeners are going to kind of be distracting.
That's right.
Right?
Yep.
So if you don't have a camera on, maybe you come off of mute and you start having a side conversation. Who knows?
There you go. Your dog's barking.
So I've started the breakouts. There are like 5 to 6 people in a room. And if you look under participants, that's where you should be able to see where your room is, and you can go on and jump into it. So have fun participating. You don't have a lot of time, so jump on it.
Someone had asked, are we taking turns? So I just want to make sure that person got an answer to that.
Oh, thank you, Esther. Just one person needs to speak in this. It'll be an example for everyone. Great question.
I'll broadcast that out to the groups. So go find your participants, go find your breakout. Looks like we're coming back. There we are. Where is Stephanie?
I am right here. Do you see me? Can you hear me?
There you are.
Okay, excellent. You guys, how did that go? Let's hear first from a couple of people who were speaking.
Okay, I'll be first.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you, Stephanie, first and foremost. I was saying it in the chat because I always thought that, because I also have anxiety issues, and sometimes when my brain gets away, I start worrying, and then it was a doubt in me in the sense of what noise was, and I knew that I have learned in the field now that when my brain gets away, my body, like my hand starts moving too much. So I, like, something in me was telling me that is a type of noise, but I never had nobody verbally say it. But I realized it in people in front of me that when my brain gets away, they wasn't actively listening because they were kind of like worried or whatever. But then when I would calm down and started tapping into myself and looking, mindfulness and stuff like that, I discovered that I can control myself and my message is heard better. And it is very important that we understand that, because a lot of people, like I was saying in the chat, one of my girls, I have to talk to her differently with a lower voice tone. I can't move too much because I'll lose her focusness. And that's when I realized that I have to change when I speak, to certain individuals, judge the room, judge the person before I can start speaking.
Thank you so much, Danny, for sharing that comment with us. I think that's really important. I think that a lot of people will really resonate with them. So thank you so much for sharing that. Jennifer made a good comment in the chat box saying that it's distracting to hear and talk at the same time. And then one time Jennifer engaged the interrupter. So anybody else, any of the other speakers want to comment on how it felt to speak to a group of people who were clearly not actively listening to you?
Hi, Stephanie.
Hi.
It's Yasmin here. You
Hey,
were
Yasmin. Good to see
one
you.
of the facilitators in the Coalition Academy in Birmingham. So at one point, I didn't even finish, like I didn't even take the whole minute to talk because I also got distracted trying to figure out what they each were doing, and there were dogs showing up on the Zoom call and all kinds of things. But yeah, definitely it felt like, what's the point, because nobody's listening.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, and just think about there are times, and I think it's easy to make the connection when you're talking to a friend and a friend isn't actively listening to you, and you just stop talking and you're like, and it takes them a second to realize you've stopped talking. But in the professional world, it happens all the time. And it's just actively listening is simply a show of respect. I do also simultaneously, while I say that, acknowledge that there are a lot of reasons that we don't actively listen that aren't intentionally disrespectful. But when we don't actively listen to people, it shows disrespect. Cynthia says in the chat box that it feels discouraging, and certainly it does. I mean, we feel like we're wasting our time when we're in front of a group of people that we don't feel like are listening. So now I want to hear from the people who were intentionally not actively listening. And how did that feel for you? Was that just normal? Like that's how you always roll? Or was it difficult to not be an active listener?
I
Hey,
think for
Stephanie, good
me, it
morning.
was,
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
sorry. I was just going to say, I think for me that it was very difficult because the person who was talking had a topic that I'm very interested in. And so it was very difficult. I had to engage my dog to not pay attention.
Understand. Thank you, Casey. And there was somebody else who was also speaking, if they want to go ahead.
I had unmuted. Yeah, so in Yasmin's defense, we were brutal. Like all of us just kind of went off the rails. But for me personally, the conversation I had with someone is they started coughing, so I offered them a cough drop, but I didn't do it quietly. Like I wasn't like, hey, do you want a cough drop? I was like, hey, do you need a cough drop? I got a coughing thing, so I was carrying with me, and I just kept going. Whereas like normally, of course, I wouldn't do that. But so like you said, it could have been something that wasn't intended to interrupt her. It was just something I would have normally done, but not at that level. But so yeah, it felt weird because I was just completely disregarding what she said. I can't even tell you what she was talking about. That's how off center we were.
Thank you, Angela.
To me, it felt rude on like a social etiquette level. To
Yeah.
not listen to someone actively.
Yeah, absolutely, Kevin. Carlisle.
At first it was uncomfortable, but then one of the people in our group, Jennifer, started like she kind of took like a humorous approach, so then I started to jump in, and then we all kind of started making each other laugh, so it wasn't as uncomfortable as I think it was supposed to be. So it kind of worked out.
I love hearing and reading a lot of your comments in the chat. You guys keep those coming. I think that we can all agree that this was an activity that took many of us outside of our comfort zones, which is great because it means that you're naturally an active listener or that you have practiced to become an active listener. I also think that's an important point. I am inherently not a strong active listener. I have had to practice to be an active listener. I remember many days, and my mother has always done this as well. She gets so concerned about remembering the name of the person she's meeting that instead of listening to what that person is saying, she's like, remember, their name is Astrid. Remember Astrid. Remember Astrid. And so she gets in this cycle where she's trying to remember your name, and so she's not listening to what you're saying. And I find myself doing that a lot. And so I have to practice active listening. And I also have to constantly remind myself, okay, Steph, now is your time to listen. And I can click on my listening switch to make sure that I intentionally switch over to being an active listener. So what I'd like for you to consider now is I'm going to share the slide again so you have a visual cue of what I'm asking you to do. We're going to go back into a breakout. So similar scenario, however, I want everybody who is participating to really practice actively listening. So we're going to select a speaker again. You can exchange names, some brief pleasantries, but then select a speaker who's going to speak on any topic of your choice for 60 seconds. During those 60 seconds, I would like everybody else to truly practice active listening. Thinking about, as you're actively listening, how will you take this skill moving forward, and give yourself some tips or tricks so that you can always turn on your active listening switch. So any questions about what we're asking you to do here?
So be polite in this one. Intentional. So the breakout sessions are open. We have less groups now because of all the scaredy cats.
Awesome. Thank you, Kristen.
Welcome back from the breakouts, everybody. Hopefully the vibe in the room was much more pleasant.
I can tell from nonverbals, Kristen, that people seem a little bit happier coming back from this breakout session. And I just have to say, I see so many friends in the audience today. So, hey, y'all, it's so good to see all my friends here today. I love a comment that I saw come in the chat box, but I didn't see until y'all went to this activity. And so Maria said that they had fun in the first breakout, but started to think of their behavior and realized they did not practice active listening at all times. And so that's exactly why we're doing this, is to make ourselves a little bit better. So now that you had the opportunity to dive in and practice your active listening skills, how did that feel? Let's start with the speakers. So I'd like to hear from a speaker or two on how that felt when people were actively listening to you.
I can start. I did I didn't know what I was going to talk about, so I quickly Googled 20 facts about cats. So that was my theme. And, you know, the difference was, whereas at first people weren't, you know, engaging, people were engaging this time. They were commenting on what they thought was interesting, what facts that they learned for the first time. They thanked me for my time. They acknowledged that they were listening. So that was definitely the hints that they were listening.
Awesome. Thank you, Carolyn. And Dara mentions in the chat box that they were able to have a very engaging conversation. So that's super good. Go ahead, Amanda.
Well, I really appreciated being the speaker because my topic was around trying to make a Guiding Good Choices series work, and only coalition coordinators or people in the biz could understand the grief that I've endured trying to make this happen. And so it was actually really therapeutic for me, even though I just went, what could I talk about? Okay, I'll talk about this. By the end of it, with the nods and the like, ohs, and just the facial expressions, I found it very therapeutic that I have an army of 5 on my side on how difficult it's been. So it was very supportive for me.
That's so nice to hear. And I noticed a lot of nonverbals in agreement with you. Also comments in the chat as well about people just engaging. And doesn't it make you want to keep talking? Because we had people before saying, I just wanted to stop because nobody cared about what I was saying. It's totally different now when you have people who are actively listening, because it makes you want to keep talking about what you're talking about. And I think so much we are able to connect with people so much better when there is a relationship there. And part of just actively listening is what helps us to build our relationships. And so when we think about our work as community organizers or prevention specialists or whatever your specific role is in the community, we always talk about the importance of relationships. And if we are actively listening, we're going to build those relationships up on a much deeper level to a much better place. There's going to be a lot more trust and understanding than if we are not actively listening. And so that's one of the really great ways that we can help our coalitions to build our capacity is just by actively listening. And it seems so simple, but as some of us have learned, it's not necessarily inherent. And it's not necessarily simple, but the cool part about it is something that we can practice, and it is something that we can continue to hone our skills in. And so if you find yourself like me as a person who wasn't born an active listener, then excuse me, it's a great practice activity to just in your day-to-day life, just pick several times throughout the day to be an active listener. It doesn't have to be at work. It can be at home. It can be listening to the radio. It can be listening to the television. There are so many different ways we can practice active listening, but you will become a much better active listener if you practice. And so I encourage you to do so. And thank you all so much for being brave and for participating in our breakout session. I hope it wasn't too painful for you. So we promise no more breakout sessions for the rest of the day today. So you're free and clear. You're off the hook. We're going to jump into talking about our environments now for our communications. And when we're effective communicators, we want to consider, and we've touched on some of these areas, we want to consider our sights and sounds. What's the temperature in the room? What's the decor or the setting? Are people physically comfortable? What's the time or day of week? Kristen and I were chatting before the session started today, and we were trying to identify a next training date. And there were a couple weeks where all I had was Friday. And we said, you know what? Friday is probably not the best time to have an afternoon training. So let's pick another week. Physiological factors. This was mentioned in the chat box: hunger or fatigue or pain or illness. So when we establish that conducive environment, thinking about sights and sounds. I've been to presentations before where people use visual aids, like a PowerPoint or a keynote presentation, for example, and there is so much animation that I just get dizzy trying to follow it all. And so we want to make sure that we are considering our entire population to whom we're speaking and understanding that everybody comes from a different place. We're going to have people and Astrid just mentioned exactly what I was getting at is there are going to be people who are on very different places from cognitive abilities to neurodivergence. And so we want to make sure that we are effective in reaching all people. We'll talk about this a little bit more and understanding that sights and sounds affect people differently. And so one thing with respect of sights is one of my closest friends has 2 young sons who are both colorblind, and it has made me much more keenly aware of how people see my slides and understanding now that there are colors that I should not use on my slides because as it turns out, so now that she has these 2 young boys who are living with color blindness, she has met hundreds of people who are like, oh yeah, I'm colorblind too, mostly men who are colorblind. And so it has made her feel better that there are people who are living normal, productive, happy lives living with color blindness, but caring for her children as I do on a regular basis has helped me understand some adaptations that I need to make to help people make sure that they see everything that I'm projecting. Temperature is easy to think about. We want people to be comfortable. And there are times where we don't want to ever have interruptions in our trainings or our meetings, but there are times where an interruption is warranted. Because if everybody in the room is absolutely freezing cold, we just need to take 30 seconds and go see if we can adjust the temperature. Decor and setting. I was training in a hotel training room in Florida one time, and the room was so oppressive. It had the wall didn't go straight up on the side because it was along the roof line. And so people on the edge of the room couldn't even stand up all the way because the ceiling was so low. And the wallpaper went all the way up to there was one little strip of white ceiling, but there was black and gold wallpaper around this entire room, not a window in sight. And it was so dark and oppressive. And so the decor of that room really put a damper on our training. So we want to consider the decor and we want to consider the setting to make sure that we have that conducive environment for communication. We want to make sure that people are physically comfortable. If we notice that people are fidgeting in their chair a lot, then we might want to take a pause and say, let's get up and have a stretch break to give people the opportunity to be comfortable. Physiological factors, again, we can always offer breaks if we need to offer breaks. And so just make sure that you're paying attention to that environment to make sure that your communication is effective. So I promised that we would get into public speaking, and we're going to do so now. So this is our fifth objective in our which may be a 3-part training series now. So thinking about public speaking, I always refer back in my brain to the Brady Bunch. Anybody watch the Brady Bunch when it was on primetime? I was young when it first started airing, but I always remember when Marsha Brady had to give a speech at school. So do y'all remember what Mr. Brady told Marsha when she was nervous about speaking and giving her speech at school? And he gave her some advice. Do you remember the advice that he gave Marsha?
Is to picture people are naked.
Yeah. Picture your people in their underwear. Picture your audience in their underwear. And so I'm not giving you, for the record, I'm not giving you that advice, especially if I'm in your audience. But what's important is to acknowledge, and I think Mr. Brady's intent was to help Marsha feel like she was on an even playing field with her audience. And so when we're speaking, some of our tips that I want to give to you is, one, plan appropriately. If you are prepared, you're going to get up and you're going to be comfortable in front of a group of people. Also, practice is really what gets us to the place of being comfortable. When I gave my first public speaking engagement as a career professional, it was, y'all, the worst. Some of you I know have heard this story before, but I was speaking in front of, I was 26 years old, had just done an extensive epidemiological analysis for the city of Knoxville, and I was presenting that analysis to both mayors, to the city council, to the county commission, to the superintendent of schools, and all these elected people who were very intimidating to me at that time in my life. And what was supposed to be an hour-and-a-half presentation ended in about 15 minutes. I spoke so fast, I couldn't wait to get through that content and for it to be over. And so thinking about that presentation that was about 20 years ago, a little over 20 years ago now, to where I am now is almost laughable, because I'm pretty comfortable speaking in front of groups of people. I was speaking to the American Public Health Association in November, and I found out 2 days before that there were 10,000 people attending that conference. And I was like, oh, okay. I mean, largest audience I've ever spoken to, but it's okay. I've got this. But it's because we just have to get in there and do it. And the more we speak in front of a group, the more comfortable we're going to be. But if we are confident about the subject matter that we are speaking, we're also going to be more comfortable. And so that's what practice means. And I've read before that when we're talking about public speaking, that practice, a lot of times people say practice makes perfect. And I've read some articles that argue practice does not make perfect, but practice makes you comfortable. We don't have to be perfect when we're public speaking. We just need to be comfortable, and we need to make our audience comfortable too. Your audience is pulling for you. I mentioned this before. They truly want you to succeed because nobody wants to sit in the audience where somebody is just having a horrible time presenting. It's uncomfortable for them, and it is uncomfortable for us too. So engage your audience. It's so much more dynamic and so much more fun to give a training or to give a speech or talk to people when there's interaction. People really don't want to sit down and just listen to you just read slides. That's boring. So avoid that, but pay attention to body language. Let's see, I'm running out of time for stories, but body language is really important. And for me, I have had to really focus on my body language to make sure that I am portraying to my audience my intent inside my heart. Because on the outside, I have kind of a rough, intimidating personality, but that's not how I feel in my heart. So I have to really focus on what my body language is saying to people. And then think positively. If you say, and my dad used to do this with me as a kid, he would say, just visualize it. If you can visualize it, you can go and do it. So think positively. Visualize yourself getting up on the stage or walking up to the podium or walking to the front of the classroom and just hitting a home run with your speech. And then cope with your nerves. So this is where we had a question before. What do we do about the fidgety hands? So when we cope with our nerves, there is a physiological response that our body has when we're nervous. When we are nervous, my therapist helped me understand this, and I still catch myself holding my breath. When we are nervous or have anxiety, we physiologically, it is an automatic response that happens in our brain. We hold our breath. When we hold our breath, have you ever seen somebody speaking and they sound out of breath? They're out of breath because they're not breathing. So if we can just press pause and take a breath, that will help us cope with our nerves. You'll see people who are speaking and their hands will be shaking a little bit, which is why they'll start to fidget with their hands. And so their hands are shaking because their body is not getting enough oxygen because they're not breathing. And so allow yourself a moment to take a deep breath. Because while you might be a subject matter expert on your topic, your population, your audience probably is not. They might be hearing this information for the very first time ever. And so while you feel like you need to bounce through it very quickly and get to a place where, excuse me, there's no silence, your audience needs a minute to process what you're saying. And so practice those pauses that might feel like awkward pauses for you, but it's okay if you need to pause and take a deep breath. It is okay if you need to pause and take a sip of water. Nobody's going to think that's weird, and it's going to give you the ability to reset so that you can cope with your nerves. Another great idea about coping with the hand fidgeting is my uncle spoke. He worked for a very large corporation and traveled internationally giving very large presentations. And he met with a speech coach, and the speech coach recommended to him to carry a paperclip in his suit pocket so that when he felt himself getting uncomfortable or getting nervous, all he needed to do was stick his hand in his pocket and touch that paperclip. Because he would practice with the paperclip, he would hold the paperclip and it would remind him to take a deep breath. So he would hold that paperclip at his desk, take a few deep breaths. So then every time he touched that paperclip, it reminded him to take a deep breath. So for me, it wasn't a paperclip. For me, it became a pen. And now we all hold clickers in our hand. And so then it became a clicker to advance my slides. But have something that you're able to hold that's not a distraction for your audience, that when you hold that, it reminds you, take a deep breath or pause and take a sip of water. It is a natural part of being a presenter or a speaker to breathe. Nobody's going to fault you for that. And there's great conversation going on in the chat, so make sure that you're checking that out. Watch recordings of yourself speaking. We are our own toughest critic. And so if you watch a recording of yourself speaking and this comment or this conversation is going on in the chat box, you will identify your filler word. Almost everybody has a filler word because I mentioned we don't like that awkward moment of silence, but those moments of silence are important for your participant, for your audience. So allow those to sit. Make yourself comfortable in those moments to avoid using filler words. We use filler words because we want to always bridge from, we want people to make sure that they interpret that we're smart. And so we use those filler words so that our sentences butt right up next to each other, but they don't have to. And so watch a recording of yourself speaking and figure out what your filler word is. I actually, when I first watched a recording of myself speaking, it was about 15 years ago, I had to take a tally of my filler word. My filler word used to be so. It probably still is. I try not to use filler words, but in I think a 60-second speech, I believe I used my filler word 15 times or something ridiculous. So figure out what your filler word is. Try to eliminate it from your vocabulary, not just when you're public speaking, but all the time. Slow down. We will slow down when we take a deep breath. And so give yourself, I don't know if you just noticed, but I was starting to speak fast and I just took a deep breath. So give yourself the opportunity to take that deep breath. By the way, who thought that was awkward? Did anybody think it was awkward when I took a breath? Okay. So see, I don't think anybody said yes. Give yourself permission to take those breaths, to take a sip of water, to slow down, and then use your visual aids appropriately. Use them in a way that makes sense for your audience, that is not a distraction, but is an aid. When we want to up our game in our public speaking, understand that nervousness is normal. So just practice and prepare. But don't associate adrenaline reactions with negativity. So understand that if you hold your breath, and I encourage you to practice this after our session, hold your breath and see what happens physiologically with your body. Because you're going to get a little bit out of breath. If you're talking, you're gonna start talking faster because you're trying to get words in between breaths because you're having to breathe more frequently. You're gonna feel a little bit jittery. So this is just a normal human body response. So don't associate that with negativity, that you're just feeling that way because you're public speaking. We talked about filler words and eliminating those, but we also want to know our audience. If we can connect with our audience on whatever it is. So if we're working with a group of people, I want to just have a little tiny casual conversation with them. Kristen started us out today like that, asking about who you are, where are you from, what's the weather like where you are. We just started off kind of casually getting to know each other. That gives us an opportunity to be adaptable, be dynamic in our speaking so that we can meet our audience where they are. Because if I learn that there's 5 members of my audience that only has 12 people in it and we all have 7-year-old kids, then I can start to tie in stories that I know are going to resonate with them. And so this ties back to our conversation last week about your avatar. We want to figure out who's going to be in our audience so that we can anticipate the content to provide to them. We also want to be adaptable enough to where we can change on the fly if we need to, if we figure out who our avatar is in that session. And I think most importantly, you have to be authentically yourself. I know that as being a CADCA master trainer and working up through the ranks, the CADCA trainings are very scripted. There is content that has to be provided, and there are a lot of people giving the same content. And so there are guides that help trainers know exactly what the learning objectives are and the content that we need to cover. Anybody remember Dave Chevelle? So Dave Chevelle, one of my most dear friends, he's been training in the field for over 30 years. So he's like the master of prevention. So Dave tells a lot of frog and snail jokes. So if you've ever been in one of his trainings, you've probably heard one of his frog or snail jokes. And so it was in our trainer guide. So I start giving one of these frog jokes and it just bombed, y'all. I mean, I remember where I was at the Hilton in Birmingham, Alabama. It was so memorable and it was so terrible because I was telling one of Dave's jokes. I wasn't making the content mine. I was trying to emulate Dave Chappelle. Well, if you've ever met Dave Chappelle, you will know that we are two very different people and our styles are very different. And so you've got to authentically be yourself to make sure that you connect with your audience in a way where they trust you and they see you as being authentic. And then make it comfortable. Let your own personality come through. Use humor. The very first time, well, not the very first time, early in my career, I was giving a presentation to the North Knoxville Rotary Club, and they put a article in the newspaper after I left saying the angel of death came to speak to them because I was talking about the number of youth who had died from drug overdose. Well, at that time in my career, I wasn't adaptable enough to be able to use the levity of the situation and also talk about prevention and all of the lives we were saving. And so we talk about some heavy stuff in our field. And I don't want to discount that we have to address those issues, but we also can put a positive spin on it always because we're doing great work and we're saving a lot of lives too. And so we want to make sure that we focus on the positive and not always dwell on the negative. Please, please don't read your slides. If you're going to ask me to come to a meeting or a speech or a training and you're going to read your slides, please just send me your PowerPoint. I can read them myself. I will be bored to death. Think about your nonverbal communication and use it effectively so that you're able to connect with your people, and your slides should be your outline. And so we can connect our slides to our people and then let your personality be that connecting force. Then we want to grab their attention at the beginning. If we don't connect with people and hook them in the first probably 7 minutes of when we're speaking to them, we're going to lose them the whole time because they're going to start doing something else. They're going to be scrolling through their social media. They're going to be doing everything but listening to you. And then we want to close with a dynamic ending. And what does that mean? Well, we want to make sure that we are working with them we're going to tell them what we're going to say it, and then we're going to tell them what we told them. That's how our trainings kind of come together. And then use your audio visuals wisely. We're going to push pause and work on, so we'll have a session 3 that is coming up. Kristen will tell you more about that. But I do want to acknowledge, because I just told you that we tell you what we're going to tell you, and then we tell you what we're saying, and then we're going to summarize what we told you. So I am going to summarize our content today. So in our last session, we talked about meeting that avatar and thinking about how we market and communicate our coalition's work. So today we talked about the importance of interpersonal communication and active listening. And then we talked about our skills in public speaking and how we can hone those to make sure that we're really connecting with our audience. So we're going to pull both of these sessions together the next time we're together. And we're going to talk about interpersonal and group communication techniques and how coalitions can collaborate with communication across their strategic plans so that we can have a communication plan that we have in place that's an actual product that we can use so that any member or volunteer of our organization knows how to effectively communicate across everything that we do. So with that, Kristen, I'm going to turn things back over to you and let you walk us through the evaluation and next steps.